The courtroom door swung open with a low creak that echoed through the silent chamber. David Mitchell walked in first, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor with the rhythm of a man who had already won. His attorney, Richard Hastings, followed close behind, a shark in a $3,000 suit, carrying a leather briefcase that cost more than most people's monthly rent. David looked relaxed, almost casual, despite wearing a tailored navy suit that had been custom-made for this exact moment. He smiled as he took his seat at the plaintiff's table, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who knew the outcome before the proceedings even started. The courtroom was small, one of the family court chambers in downtown Seattle, with wood paneling that had darkened with age and fluorescent lights that cast everything in a harsh, unflattering glow. A few scattered observers sat in the gallery, family members, court watchers, a law student taking notes. David's sister Emily sat directly behind him, along with his mother Patricia, both dressed as if attending a social event rather than a divorce hearing. They whispered to each other, occasionally glancing toward the defendant's empty table, with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed satisfaction. "This is going to be quick," David said to Richard, not bothering to lower his voice. "I told you she wouldn't put up a fight." Richard, ever the professional, gave a slight nod but said nothing. He'd been practicing law for 30 years and had learned that courtrooms were unpredictable, but even he had to admit that this case looked like a clean sweep. His client had money, assets, documentation, and a prenup that heavily favored him. The wife had nothing, as far as anyone could tell. Then she walked in. Sarah Mitchell, soon to be Sarah Parker again, entered through the same door her husband had used moments before. She was alone. No attorney. Walking beside her. No briefcase full of documents, no confident swagger. She wore a simple gray dress that looked like it came from a department store clearance rack, her dark hair pulled back in a plain ponytail with a simple elastic band. She carried a single manila folder, the cheap kind you could buy at any office supply store, and a worn purse that had seen better years. That was it. No rolling case full of exhibits, no tablet or laptop, no legal assistant scurrying behind her with files. The courtroom noticed immediately. David saw her first, and his smile widened into something that wasn't quite a grin but close enough to be offensive. He leaned toward Richard and whispered loudly enough for several people to hear, "I guess the yoga studio's salary doesn't cover attorney fees." Richard suppressed a laugh, covering his mouth with his hand as if clearing his throat. Behind them, Emily let out a small, sharp sound that might have been a cough or might have been contempt. "Is she really doing this herself?" she whispered to Patricia. Patricia, wearing a designer suit and enough jewelry to pay for a decent lawyer, shook her head slowly. "This is embarrassing. For her, I mean. She's going to humiliate herself in front of a judge." Even the bailiff, a stern woman in her 50s named Rodriguez, who had seen hundreds of these cases, raised an eyebrow as Sarah approached the defendant's table. Bailiff Rodriguez had spent enough time in family court to recognize the signs of someone completely out of their depth. The cheap clothes, the absence of legal representation, the single folder that probably contained little more than a copy of the divorce petition, and maybe some bank statements hastily printed at home. Sarah walked to the defendant's table and sat down, placing her folder carefully in front of her, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table. She smoothed her dress, folded her hands in her lap, and sat completely still. She didn't look at David. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't look at the hostile stares coming from David's family in the gallery. She simply sat, hands folded, eyes straight ahead, waiting with a patience that could have been mistaken for resignation. The whispers started immediately, rippling through the small gallery like wind through grass. "She doesn't have a lawyer," someone murmured from the back row, loud enough to be heard several seats away. "She's representing herself against Hastings. She's going to get destroyed," another voice added, this one belonging to an older man who appeared to be a regular court observer, someone who showed up to watch proceedings the way other people watch sports. "This is going to be over in 20 minutes. Poor woman probably doesn't even understand how badly she's about to get screwed," a woman in the third row said to her companion, shaking her head with something that looked like pity. David didn't even try to hide his satisfaction. He turned fully in his seat and made direct eye contact with Sarah for the first time since she'd entered the courtroom. His expression was one of complete triumph mixed with theatrical concern. As if he were looking at a wounded animal he was about to put out of its misery. "Couldn't afford a lawyer, Sarah?" he asked, his voice pitched loudly enough for everyone to hear, carrying across the small courtroom with perfect clarity. "I told you this would be expensive. I offered to make this easy, remember? I sent you 3 settlement proposals, 3. All you had to do was sign one, and we could have avoided this whole mess, but you wanted to do it the hard way." He shook his head slowly, like a disappointed parent addressing a stubborn child. "I hope you understand what you're walking into here. This isn't yoga class. This is a legal proceeding. There are rules, procedures, things you can't possibly understand without proper representation." Sarah said nothing. She didn't even look at him. She simply continued sitting, hands folded in her lap, her expression completely neutral, not defiant, not scared, not angry, just blank, waiting. Richard Hastings leaned over and whispered something to David, placing a hand on his client's arm as if to restrain him from further commentary. But David ignored the gesture, his confidence building with every second of Sarah's silence. "I mean it, Sarah," David continued, his voice taking on an edge of false sympathy that made it even more condescending. "It's not too late to call this off. We can step outside right now, sign the settlement I offered, and you can walk away with something. Not much, but something. Because, I'll be honest with you, if we go through with this hearing, if you try to represent yourself against my attorney, you're going to leave here with nothing. Less than nothing." Emily giggled behind him, a sound she tried to muffle with her hand, but failed. Patricia didn't even bother hiding her smirk, her expression one of someone watching a social inferior get what they deserved. Still, Sarah said nothing. Her silence seemed to fuel David's momentum, confirming in his mind that she was simply too overwhelmed, too intimidated, too broken to fight back. "Last chance," David said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a gentle, reasonable tone, but which came across as patronizing. "Walk out with me right now, and I'll give you the Honda and $50,000. That's it. That's my final offer. But if you make me go through this hearing, if you waste the court's time with this," he gestured vaguely at her empty table, "amateur hour performance, I'll fight for every penny. You'll leave here with nothing but debt and humiliation." Richard Hastings finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "David, stop talking. Now." But the damage was done. The entire courtroom had witnessed David's performance, his absolute certainty that his wife was defeated before the proceedings had even begun. Several people in the gallery were shaking their heads. Whether in sympathy for Sarah or disgust at David's behavior, it was hard to tell. Sarah's hands remained folded, her expression remained neutral, and she said nothing at all. "You are about to witness the most satisfying courtroom reversal ever recorded, a moment when arrogance, mockery, and the assumption that someone is defenseless collides with the devastating reality that they were never weak at all, just patient." The bailiff stood. "All rise. The Superior Court of King County is now in session, the Honorable Judge Margaret Chen presiding." Everyone stood as Judge Chen entered from her chambers. She was a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair cut short and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been a family court judge for 23 years and had a reputation for being fair but unsympathetic to games or manipulation. She sat, arranged her papers, and looked out at the courtroom. "Please be seated," she said, her voice carried authority without needing volume. Everyone sat. Judge Chen reviewed the documents in front of her. "We are here today for the dissolution of marriage case, Mitchell versus Mitchell, case number 2024-301847. Mr. Mitchell is present with counsel. Mrs. Mitchell..." She looked up, her eyes finding Sarah at the defendant's table. "Mrs. Mitchell, I see you are appearing without legal representation. Is that correct?" Sarah stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "Have you attempted to retain counsel?" "No, Your Honor." Judge Chen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, concern perhaps, or wariness. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to inform you that you have the right to legal representation in these proceedings. Divorce cases involving asset division and potential spousal support can be complex. Are you certain you wish to proceed without an attorney?" "Yes, Your Honor, I'm certain." "Very well. Let the record show that Mrs. Mitchell has waived her right to counsel and is proceeding pro se. Mr. Hastings, you may begin with your opening statement." Richard Hastings stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. He was 55, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of winning. He walked to the center of the courtroom, positioning himself between the judge and the jury box. Though there was no jury in a divorce case, old habits died hard. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of marriage dissolution. My client, Mr. David Mitchell, is seeking a fair and equitable division of marital assets following an irreconcilable breakdown of his 7-year marriage to Mrs. Sarah Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell has been the primary financial provider throughout this marriage, earning a substantial income as a senior software engineer at Tech Vision Solutions, while Mrs. Mitchell has worked part-time as a yoga instructor, contributing minimally to the household finances. David nodded along, his expression serious, now playing the role of the reasonable party. Mr. Mitchell is not seeking to be vindictive, Richard continued. He simply wants what is fair. He is willing to offer Mrs. Mitchell a settlement of $50,000 and the 2015 Honda Civic currently registered in her name. In exchange, he would retain the marital home, his retirement accounts, and his stock options from Tech Vision. Given that Mr. Mitchell purchased the home with funds that predated the marriage and that his retirement accounts represent his sole earnings, we believe this is more than generous. Richard paused, letting that sink in. $50,000 after 7 years of marriage. It was insultingly low, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Furthermore, Your Honor, Mrs. Mitchell has repeatedly refused to engage in good faith settlement negotiations. She has declined multiple offers to resolve this matter outside of court. She has failed to retain legal counsel, which suggests either an inability to afford representation or a deliberate strategy to elicit sympathy. Either way, Mr. Mitchell simply wants to move forward with his life. He is prepared to present documentation of all marital assets, his income, and his reasonable proposal for division. Thank you. Richard sat down, and David patted him on the shoulder, a gesture of congratulation that was visible to everyone. Judge Chen turned to Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, do you wish to make an opening statement? Sarah stood again. She didn't move from behind her table. She didn't have the commanding presence of Richard Hastings. She simply stood there in her department store dress and said, No, Your Honor, not at this time. The whispers started again, louder now. She's not even going to defend herself. This is going to be a slaughter. Judge Chen frowned slightly but nodded. Very well. Mr. Hastings, you may call your first witness. Your Honor, I call David Mitchell to the stand. David stood and walked to the witness box. With the easy confidence of a man who had rehearsed this moment, he was sworn in and took his seat, settling back as if he were being interviewed for a magazine profile rather than testifying in his own divorce. Richard walked him through the basics. His employment at Tech Vision Solutions, his annual salary of $180,000 plus stock options, the timeline of the marriage, the purchase of the house in Madison Park using funds from his premarital savings account. Everything was presented as fact, supported by documents that Richard entered into evidence with smooth efficiency. Mr. Mitchell, Richard said, can you describe the financial arrangement in your marriage? I was the primary earner, David said, his voice steady and reasonable. Sarah worked part-time teaching yoga classes, which brought in maybe $20,000 a year, if that. I paid for the house, the cars, the groceries, the utilities, everything. I don't say that to diminish her contribution to the household, but financially speaking, I carried the load. And did Mrs. Mitchell contribute in other ways? Of course. She maintained the home, cooked meals, managed household errands. I'm not saying she did nothing. I'm just saying that when it comes to the assets we accumulated during the marriage, they primarily came from my income. Thank you. Now, Mr. Mitchell, you've offered Mrs. Mitchell a settlement of $50,000. Can you explain the reasoning behind that amount? David shifted, looking directly at Sarah for the first time since taking the stand. She still hadn't looked at him. I wanted to be fair. $50,000 is enough for her to get an apartment, buy furniture, cover her expenses while she gets on her feet. I'm also not asking for any contribution from her toward the mortgage I've been paying for 7 years. I think that's more than reasonable. And the house? You're requesting sole ownership of the marital home? Yes. I bought that house with $200,000 from my savings before we got married. Sarah moved into my house. It was never really hers in the first place. Richard nodded slowly, as if this were all perfectly logical. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Chen turned to Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, do you wish to cross-examine? Sarah stood. No, Your Honor. Gasps and whispers erupted in the gallery. She wasn't even going to question him. She was just letting him tell his version without challenge. David couldn't hide his smile now. This was going even better than he'd expected. Judge Chen looked troubled, but continued. Mr. Hastings, do you have additional witnesses? No, Your Honor. The documentary evidence speaks for itself. We have bank statements, tax returns, the deed to the house showing Mr. Mitchell's name, and retirement account statements. Everything supports our position. Very well. Mrs. Mitchell, do you wish to present any evidence or call any witnesses? This was it. The moment everyone expected Sarah to fold completely, to perhaps make a tearful plea for fairness, or maybe just accept whatever the court decided to give her. Sarah stood one more time, and this time she spoke with a clarity that cut through the whispers. Yes, Your Honor, I would like to present evidence, and I do have witnesses. I chose not to bring a lawyer today because I decided instead to bring my family. I'd like to call my first witness. The courtroom went completely silent. Judge Chen looked surprised but nodded. Proceed. Sarah turned toward the courtroom doors. I'd like to call Commander Lucas Parker to the stand. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The man who walked through them commanded immediate attention. He was in his late 30s, tall and powerfully built, wearing a navy dress uniform with ribbons and insignia that meant nothing to most civilians but everything to anyone who understood military service. His bearing was unmistakable. Shoulders back, spine straight, eyes forward. He walked with the controlled precision of someone who had been trained to move with purpose in any situation. David's smile vanished. The gallery came alive with whispers, louder now, confused and curious. The man walked to the witness box, was sworn in, and sat down with the same controlled precision he'd used to walk. Sarah approached the witness stand. Her voice was still quiet, but it had changed somehow, steadier, more focused. Please state your name and occupation for the record. Commander Lucas Parker, United States Navy. I'm currently assigned to Naval Special Warfare Group 1. Can you clarify what Naval Special Warfare Group 1 is? It's the administrative command for SEAL Teams 1, 3, 5, and 7, among other units. I'm a SEAL Team commander. The courtroom erupted. Judge Chen gavelled for order. Quiet in the court! David was staring at Lucas with an expression caught between shock and fear. Richard Hastings had gone very still, his legal instincts kicking. This was not good. Sarah continued, her voice calm. Commander Parker, what is your relationship to me? I'm your brother. And why are you here today? You asked me to come. You said you needed someone who could testify to certain facts about your marriage and your husband's behavior. I took leave to be here. David leaned over to Richard and hissed something. Richard held up a hand, watching carefully. Judge Chen leaned forward. Commander Parker, I want to be clear about something. Are you here to intimidate anyone in this courtroom? Lucas looked directly at the judge, his expression completely neutral. No, Your Honor, I'm here to testify truthfully and to ensure my sister's rights are protected. I'm not here to threaten anyone or to use my position to influence these proceedings. I'm here as Sarah's brother, not as a SEAL. Judge Chen studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. Continue, Mrs. Mitchell. Sarah took a breath. Commander Parker, how often have you communicated with me during my marriage to David Mitchell? Weekly, at minimum, sometimes more frequently when I was stateside. We're close. And during those communications, did I ever discuss my marriage? Yes, frequently. What did I tell you? Richard stood. Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. Judge Chen looked at Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, are you familiar with the hearsay rule? Yes, Your Honor. I'm not offering this testimony to prove the truth of what I said, but rather to establish that I communicated concerns to my brother about my marriage, which is relevant to explaining why I chose to bring family members instead of a lawyer. Judge Chen looked impressed despite herself. Overruled. Continue. Lucas shifted in his seat. Sarah told me that David was controlling, that he monitored her spending, criticized her job, isolated her from friends. She said he made her feel worthless. She said he told her repeatedly that she contributed nothing to the marriage and that she should be grateful he provided for her. David's face had gone red. He leaned toward Richard again, speaking urgently. Sarah continued. Commander Parker, did you ever meet David Mitchell? Yes, twice. Once at your wedding, and once when I was home on leave about 3 years ago. What was your impression of him? Objection, Richard was on his feet. Irrelevant and prejudicial. Your Honor, Sarah said quietly, Mr. Mitchell's attorney spent considerable time establishing my husband's character as reasonable and generous. I think it's fair to present an alternative perspective. Judge Chen paused. I'll allow it, but keep it relevant, Mrs. Mitchell. Lucas continued, his voice flat and factual. My impression was that David was condescending towards Sarah. At the wedding, he introduced her to his colleagues as just a yoga instructor and made jokes about her income. When I visited 3 years ago, he spoke to her the way someone might speak to a child, explaining basic concepts, correcting her in front of me, dismissing her opinions. It was subtle, but consistent. Thank you, Commander. I have no further questions. Judge Chen turned to Richard. Mr. Hastings, do you wish to cross-examine? Richard stood, and for the first time since the proceedings began, he looked uncertain. You didn't cross-examine a decorated Navy SEAL without a very good reason, and everything Lucas had said was observation and opinion, hard to challenge, harder to disprove. Commander Parker, Richard began carefully, you said you spoke to your sister weekly. During those conversations, did she ever mention filing for divorce? Yes, multiple times over the last 2 years. And did you encourage her to do so? I encouraged her to do what was best for her safety and well-being. If that meant divorce, then yes. Safety? Richard pounced on the word. Are you suggesting Mr. Mitchell was violent? No, I'm suggesting that psychological harm is also a safety issue. Sarah was being systematically degraded and controlled. That's a form of harm. Richard tried another angle. Commander, isn't it true that you have a vested interest in your sister's financial outcome in this divorce? No, I have an interest in my sister's well-being. I don't benefit financially from any outcome here. But you're here to help her get more money in the settlement, correct? I'm here to make sure she gets what she's entitled to under the law. That's not the same thing. Richard realized he was losing this exchange and sat down. No further questions. Sarah spoke again. Your Honor, I'd like to call my next witness. I call Carol Parker to the stand. The courtroom doors opened again. The woman who entered was in her mid-60s, with gray hair cut in a neat bob and sharp, intelligent eyes behind frameless glasses. She wore a simple but professional pantsuit and carried herself with quiet dignity. She walked to the stand with the same calm purposefulness her son had shown. David whispered urgently to Richard, "Who the hell is this?" After being sworn in, the woman sat and folded her hands in her lap. Sarah approached. Please state your name and occupation. Carol Parker. I'm retired, but I worked for 32 years as a paralegal and financial analyst, specializing in divorce asset investigation. The energy in the courtroom shifted again. David's face had gone from red to pale. Mrs. Parker, what is your relationship to me? I'm your mother. And why are you here today? Carol's voice was calm, but carried an edge that suggested she didn't suffer fools. Because you asked me to review the financial documents related to your marriage and help you understand what you're entitled to. Because I've spent 3 decades helping people uncover hidden assets in divorce cases. And because I'm your mother, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let anyone cheat my daughter. Judge Chen allowed herself a small smile. Sarah handed her mother a folder. Mrs. Parker, have you had an opportunity to review the financial disclosures provided by Mr. Mitchell in these proceedings? I have, thoroughly. And what did you find? Carol opened the folder, pulling out documents. I found multiple discrepancies, omissions, and what appear to be deliberate attempts to conceal marital assets. Richard shot to his feet. Objection. Your Honor, this witness is not a certified forensic accountant. Her opinions are not... Carol cut him off, her voice sharp. I may not be a CPA, Mr. Hastings, but I've worked on over 300 divorce cases, and I know how to read a bank statement. Would you like me to list my credentials, or would you prefer I just explain what your client is hiding? Judge Chen gavelled. Mrs. Parker, please address the court, not opposing counsel. But, Mr. Hastings, I'm going to allow this testimony. You can challenge her qualifications on cross. Continue, Mrs. Parker. Carol pulled out a document. Let's start with the Tech Vision Solutions stock options. Mr. Mitchell disclosed options worth approximately $80,000. But according to TechVision's public filings and the vesting schedule for senior engineers, Mr. Mitchell should have stock options worth closer to $340,000. That's a discrepancy of $260,000. David grabbed Richard's arm. Richard was scribbling notes frantically. Carol continued, pulling out another document. Second, Mr. Mitchell claims he purchased the marital home with $200,000 in premarital funds. But I obtained the original purchase documents through public records. The house was purchased for $425,000. Mr. Mitchell put down $200,000? Yes, but the remaining $225,000 was paid from a joint account, opened 6 months after the marriage. That means $225,000 of marital funds went into this house, which makes it partially marital property. Sarah handed her mother another folder. Carol opened it without missing a beat. Third, Mr. Mitchell has a personal investment account with Fidelity that he did not disclose in his asset list. I obtained statements through a request Sarah made under her legal right to financial discovery. The account currently has a balance of $127,000, all accumulated during the marriage. Richard stood again. Your Honor, how did this witness obtain private financial documents? This is through legal means, Mr. Hastings, Carol said coldly. Sarah is entitled to discovery. She requested documents and the institutions provided them. It's all perfectly legal, as I'm sure you know. Judge Chen's expression had grown progressively more serious as Carol spoke. Mrs. Parker, are you alleging that Mr. Mitchell deliberately concealed assets? Yes, Your Honor, I'm alleging exactly that. And I can provide documentation for all of it. Judge Chen turned to David and Richard. Mr. Hastings, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to these allegations, but I want to be very clear. If Mr. Mitchell has failed to disclose assets in these proceedings, there will be serious consequences. Richard stood, and for the first time, he looked rattled. Your Honor, we will need time to review these documents and you'll have it, but for now, I want Mr. Mitchell back on the stand. Now. David walked to the witness box like a man walking to his execution. The confidence was gone, replaced by barely concealed panic. Judge Chen didn't waste time. Mr. Mitchell, did you disclose all of your assets in your financial declaration to this court? Yes, Your Honor. I disclosed everything Did you have stock options worth $340,000? David hesitated. The valuation is complicated. Some of those options aren't vested yet, and that's not what I asked. Do you have stock options worth approximately that amount? It's a yes. Did you disclose an investment account with Fidelity? Silence. Mr. Mitchell, answer the question. I forgot about that account. It's been inactive. 4. The statements Mrs. Parker provided show activity as recent as last month. Did you or did you not deliberately fail to disclose this account? David looked at Richard, who could offer no help. I didn't think it was relevant, David said weakly. Judge Chen's voice went cold. You didn't think a $127,000 account was relevant to a divorce proceeding involving asset division? Mr. Mitchell, I've been doing this for 23 years. Don't insult my intelligence. She turned to Richard. Mr. Hastings, I'm suspending these proceedings. I'm ordering a complete financial audit of all accounts, assets, and income streams associated with Mr. Mitchell. I'm also freezing all marital assets pending the outcome of that audit. If this audit reveals further concealment, I will be referring this matter to the State Bar for investigation into whether Mr. Mitchell committed fraud upon this court. Do you understand? Richard nodded, his face ashen. Judge Chen turned to Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, I apologize that you've been put in this position. While I cannot offer legal advice, I strongly suggest you consider retaining counsel for the next phase of these proceedings. However, I must say, your preparation today was impressive. Sarah nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Chen banged her gavel. This hearing is adjourned pending completion of the financial audit. Mr. Mitchell is ordered to cooperate fully with all discovery requests. We will reconvene in 60 days. Court dismissed. The courtroom erupted in whispers and shocked murmurs. David sat in the witness box, staring at nothing. Richard was already on his phone, presumably calling the accountants who would now have to explain how they had missed or helped hide so many assets. Sarah walked back to the defendant's table and gathered her single folder. Lucas and Carol joined her, flanking her on either side. David finally found his voice. "Sarah, this is insane. You can't—" Lucas turned and looked. At him. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look was enough. David went silent. Sarah, Lucas, and Carol walked toward the courtroom exit. As they passed David's table, Carol paused and looked down at Richard Hastings. "You should choose your clients more carefully, Mr. Hastings," she said quietly. "And next time someone shows up without a lawyer, consider the possibility that they don't need one because they're bringing something better." They left the courtroom together. Outside in the hallway, Lucas put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You okay?" Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm okay." Carol was already on her phone. "I'm calling Robert Chen. He's a family law attorney I worked with for years. He'll represent you for the next hearing, and he owes me enough favors that he'll do it at a discount." "Mom, I can't afford—" "Sarah, you're about to be awarded a significant portion of assets your husband tried to hide. You can afford it, and besides, after what we just did to David Mitchell's case, this next phase is going to be cleanup. The hard part is over." Lucas smiled, a rare expression for him. "She's right. You gutted him in there. I'm actually kind of proud." Sarah laughed, and it felt like the first real laugh she'd had in years. "I just didn't want to give him the satisfaction of watching me fall apart." "He thought you were weak," Lucas said. "He thought showing up without a lawyer meant you were helpless." "Everyone did," Sarah agreed. "Even the judge looked worried at first." Carol put her phone away. "That's the mistake people make. They assume that if you don't look powerful, you're not. They assume if you're quiet, you're weak. They assume if you don't fight the way they expect, you've already lost." "But you were never fighting his fight," Lucas added. "You were fighting smart." Sarah looked back at the courtroom doors. Through the small window, she could see David and Richard in heated discussion, both of them, gesturing frantically. "Do you think he knew?" Sarah asked. "Do you think he knew what he was walking into?" Carol shook her head. "Not a chance. Men like David Mitchell are so convinced of their own superiority that they can't imagine being outsmarted. He thought he had all the power because he had the money and the lawyer. He never stopped to consider that power comes in different forms. Like a Navy SEAL brother and a paralegal mother," Lucas said with a slight smile. "Exactly," Carol confirmed. "He brought a lawyer. You brought family. And family who knew exactly what they were doing." They walked toward the exit, leaving the courthouse behind. Sarah had one more question. "Mom, how did you get all those documents? The fidelity statements, the stock option valuations? How did you get them so fast?" Carol smiled. "I called in some favors. I spent 30 years building relationships with people in HR departments, financial institutions, and public records offices. When I told them I was helping my daughter get what she deserved in a divorce, they were more than happy to expedite requests. People like helping when they know someone's being wronged. And the stock option information? TechVision is a publicly traded company. They're required to file executive compensation disclosures. David is listed as a senior engineer, which means his compensation structure is public record. I just had to know where to look." Lucas added, "And she had me review everything to make sure it was obtained legally. We weren't going to give Hastings any ammunition to get the evidence thrown out." Sarah shook her head in amazement. "I spent a month thinking I was going to walk in there and just get destroyed. I thought I'd end up with nothing." "You would have," Carol said bluntly, "if you'd gone in there alone without a plan. David was counting on that. He was counting on you being too intimidated, too overwhelmed, too ashamed to fight back. That's how men like him operate." "But you weren't alone," Lucas said. "You were never alone." 3 months later, Sarah sat in a different courtroom for the final hearing. This time, she had Robert Chen beside her, a sharp, methodical attorney in his 50s who had spent the past 90 days systematically dismantling what remained of David's case like a surgeon removing a tumor one cell at a time. The financial audit had revealed even more than Carol had uncovered in her initial investigation. David had a second retirement account at Vanguard that he'd failed to disclose, hiding behind the excuse that it was dormant, even though it had $87,000 in it, and had received contributions as recently as 6 months ago. He had a cryptocurrency wallet worth $43,000, Bitcoin and Ethereum that he'd purchased during the marriage using marital funds, but had failed to mention in any financial disclosure. And perhaps most damning, he'd been systematically transferring money to a personal account in his brother's name for the past 18 months, trying to hide it from the divorce proceedings. In total, the concealed assets amounted to more than $600,000. Judge Chen had not been pleased. In fact, she had been so displeased that she'd issued an order requiring David to appear personally to explain the discrepancies, and she'd made pointed references to possible perjury charges and contempt of court sanctions. The courtroom today was the same one where it had all started 3 months ago, but the atmosphere was completely different. David sat at his table with a new attorney, a young, overworked public defender named Marcus Green, who had taken the case after Richard Hastings quietly withdrew, citing irreconcilable differences with the client in his motion to withdraw. Marcus looked like a man who had inherited a sinking ship and was desperately trying to bail water with a teaspoon. David himself looked terrible. He'd lost weight, his suit hung loosely on his frame, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The confidence, the swagger, the smug satisfaction, all of it was gone, replaced by the haunted look of a man who had drastically miscalculated and was now facing the consequences. Richard Hastings was in the gallery, watching from a safe distance. He'd shown up, Sarah suspected, to see how badly his former case had imploded, and to ensure that no one could later claim he'd been complicit in David's asset concealment. He sat in the back row, taking notes, his expression carefully neutral. Emily and Patricia were not present. After the revelations in the financial audit, they had both quietly distanced themselves from David, though Emily had sent Sarah a brief cold email that read simply, "We were wrong about you. That doesn't mean we have to like you." Sarah had deleted it without responding. Judge Chen entered, and everyone stood. She sat, arranged her papers with the same precise movements Sarah remembered from the first hearing, and looked out at the courtroom with eyes that had grown considerably less sympathetic toward David Mitchell over the past 3 months. "Please be seated," Judge Chen said, and the authority in her voice made it clear that this was not going to be a pleasant proceeding for the plaintiff. Everyone sat. Judge Chen pulled out a thick folder, the financial audit report. "I have reviewed the comprehensive audit conducted by Morrison and Associates, CPAs, retained by this court, to examine the financial disclosures in this case. The findings are troubling. Mr. Mitchell, your attorney has provided a written response to the audit, but I'd like to hear from you directly. Can you explain to this court why you failed to disclose more than $600,000 in marital assets?" David stood slowly. Marcus Green had advised him to be contrite, apologetic, and brief. "Your Honor, I made mistakes in my initial disclosures. Some of these accounts I genuinely forgot about." "You forgot about a cryptocurrency wallet worth $43,000? Judge Chen interrupted, her voice sharp. "You forgot about a retirement account with $87,000? Mr. Mitchell, I've been doing this for 23 years. I've heard every excuse. Don't insult my intelligence." David's face flushed red. "Your Honor, I was overwhelmed by the divorce process. I wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't intentionally hide. The transfers to your brother's account were deliberate, weren't they? The audit found 16 separate transfers over 18 months, totaling $127,000, all carefully timed to avoid detection. That's not forgetfulness, Mr. Mitchell. That's fraud." Marcus Green stood quickly. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges errors in judgment. He's prepared to rectify those errors by agreeing to a fair division of all discovered assets. We're not contesting the audit findings." "That's very generous of him," Judge Chen said dryly, "considering he has no choice. But the question before this court isn't just about division. It's about consequences. Mr. Mitchell attempted to perpetrate a fraud upon this court and upon his wife. That has implications beyond mere asset division." She turned to Robert Chen. "Mr. Chen, has your client provided an updated settlement proposal?" Robert stood, and unlike Marcus Green, he looked like a man who was thoroughly enjoying his day. "Yes, Your Honor. Based on the audit findings, we're requesting a 60-40 split of all marital assets in Mrs. Mitchell's favor, with the additional 10% representing a penalty for Mr. Mitchell's fraudulent concealment. We're also requesting that Mr. Mitchell be ordered to pay Mrs. Mitchell's legal fees and the cost of the financial audit, totaling approximately $47,000. David made a strangled sound. Marcus put a hand on his arm. Judge Chen looked at the numbers. Your proposal values the total marital estate at approximately $1.4 million, including the house, retirement accounts, investment accounts, and the recently discovered assets. A 60-40 split would give Mrs. Mitchell roughly $840,000. Mr. Mitchell would retain approximately $560,000. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Chen turned to Marcus. Does your client wish to contest this proposal? Marcus looked at David, who shook his head miserably. What choice did he have? Contesting would mean more hearings, more attorney fees he couldn't afford, and the very real possibility that Judge Chen would impose even harsher penalties. No, Your Honor, Marcus said quietly. My client is prepared to accept the settlement as proposed. Judge Chen nodded slowly. Very well. But before I approve this settlement, I want to address something. Mr. Mitchell, you came into this courtroom 3 months ago convinced you'd already won. You mocked your wife for not having an attorney. You treated these proceedings as a formality. You assumed that having money and legal representation meant you could control the outcome. You were wrong, dramatically wrong, and your arrogance has cost you dearly, not just in money, but in dignity, reputation, and consequences that will follow you. She paused, letting that sink in. David stared at the table, his face burning with humiliation. Mrs. Mitchell, Judge Chen continued, her tone softening slightly, you demonstrated remarkable composure under circumstances designed to intimidate you. You also demonstrated something that many people who come through this courtroom lack: preparation. You didn't have a lawyer initially, but you had something better. You had knowledge of your rights, you had documentation, and you had family who understood the system and were willing to help you navigate it. That was smart. I wish more people approached these proceedings with that level of strategic thinking. Sarah nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Chen signed several documents. I'm approving the settlement as proposed. Mrs. Mitchell will receive 60% of all marital assets. Mr. Mitchell will pay her legal fees and audit costs, and both parties will execute all necessary transfers and documents within 30 days. I'm also making a referral to the Washington State Bar Association regarding Mr. Mitchell's conduct. While he was not the attorney of record, his actions in concealing assets and making false statements warrant investigation. Finally, I'm ordering Mr. Mitchell to complete a court-mandated financial disclosure course before he can file any future legal proceedings in this jurisdiction. This is to ensure that he understands his legal obligations regarding honesty in court proceedings. She banged her gavel once, firmly. This marriage is hereby dissolved. All terms of the settlement are enforceable as of today. Mr. Mitchell, I strongly suggest you take this as a learning experience. Mrs. Mitchell, I wish you the very best. Court dismissed. The gavel came down a second time, and it was over. Sarah felt Robert Chen's hand on her shoulder. Congratulations. You just won one of the most satisfying cases I've handled in years. David remained seated at his table, staring at nothing. Marcus Green was packing up his briefcase quickly, clearly eager to be done with this case and this client. Sarah gathered her things slowly. She wanted to remember this moment, not out of vindictiveness, but because it represented something important. 3 months ago, she had walked into this courtroom believing she had no power, no voice, no chance. She had been wrong. As she stood to leave, David finally looked at her. His expression was a complicated mix of anger, humiliation, and something that might have been regret. Sarah, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She paused but didn't approach his table. I'm sorry, he said. For all of it, for how I treated you, for what I tried to do. I thought... He trailed off, unable to finish. Sarah considered him for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice calm and clear. You thought I was weak because I was quiet. You thought I was powerless because I didn't fight the way you expected. You thought showing up without a lawyer meant I'd already lost. You were wrong about all of it, David. And that's not my fault. That's yours. She turned and walked toward the exit, where Carol and Lucas were waiting in the hallway, having watched the entire proceeding from the gallery. David called after her one more time. What are you going to do now? Sarah paused at the door and looked back. I'm going to live my life, on my own terms, with people who respect me. That's what I've been trying to do all along. She left the courtroom. In the hallway, Lucas gave her a rare smile. You handled that well. The speech at the end was perfect, dignified without being cruel. Carol was already on her phone, texting someone. That was masterful. Chen tore him apart, and the bar referral, that's going to follow him for years. Sarah felt lighter than she had in years, as if a weight she'd been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. I kept thinking about that first hearing, when everyone looked at me like I was pathetic, like I'd already lost. You played it perfectly, Carol said, putting her phone away. You let them think exactly what they wanted to think. You let David get arrogant and overconfident. And then you methodically destroyed his case piece by piece. It's a classic strategy, Lucas added. Let your opponent underestimate you. Let them commit to bad positions. Let them make mistakes out of overconfidence. Then reveal what they didn't know and watch everything collapse. Sarah smiled. I learned from the best, both of you. They walked toward the courthouse exit together, passing through the marble hallways where dozens of other legal battles were unfolding in courtrooms just like the one they'd left. But Sarah wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about what came next, the house she would buy, the life she would build, the freedom she'd fought for and won. As they pushed through the heavy courthouse doors into the Seattle afternoon, Carol put an arm around Sarah's shoulders. You know what the best part of all this is? What? David thought he was teaching you a lesson by making the divorce difficult. He thought he was punishing you for leaving him. But all he actually did was force you to learn how strong you really are. He created the very thing he feared most, a version of you that won't ever let anyone treat you that way again. Lucas nodded. You walked into that first hearing as someone who'd been beaten down by 7 years of psychological abuse. You walked out of today's hearing as someone who knows exactly what they're capable of. That's the real victory here. Not the money, not the house, not the settlement, the fact that you know your own strength now. Sarah thought about that as they walked to the parking garage. It was true. 3 months ago, even 6 months ago when she'd first decided to file for divorce, she had felt small and powerless. She had internalized David's constant criticism, his subtle degradation, his message that she was less than him in every way that mattered. Now she knew better. She knew that she was smart, capable, and stronger than anyone, including herself, had given her credit for. She knew that she could face down intimidation, navigate complex systems, and fight for what was fair. She knew that asking for help wasn't weakness but wisdom, and she knew that the people who mattered, her family, her real friends, the people who actually cared about her, had been there all along, waiting to support her the moment she was ready to accept that support. That knowledge was worth more than any settlement amount. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Sarah bought a small house in Ballard with her settlement money. It was nothing fancy, a 1920s bungalow with a front porch and a garden that needed work, but it was hers, fully hers. No one could take it from her. She continued teaching yoga, but now she did it because she loved it, not because she needed the income. She started a small business offering meditation and wellness coaching. She reconnected with friends David had slowly isolated her from during their marriage. She was, for the first time in years, genuinely happy. One evening, she was having dinner with her mother at her new house when Carol brought up something unexpected. I got a call last week, Carol said, from a woman named Jennifer. She's going through a divorce, and her husband is trying the same tricks David tried, hiding assets, intimidating her, assuming she won't fight back. She asked if I could help. Sarah looked up from her meal. What did you say? I said yes, of course. I've already started reviewing her financials. And I called Lucas to see if he'd be willing to testify if needed, just to put the fear of God in the husband. Sarah laughed. What did Lucas say? He said he'd be happy to help. Turns out he enjoys watching bullies realize they picked the wrong target. Sarah thought about that. Mom, you could do this professionally. Help other women in situations like mine. Carol smiled. I've been thinking the same thing. I'm retired, but I'm not ready to stop working entirely. And this work matters. Too many women go into divorce proceedings thinking they have no power, no options. They accept terrible settlements because they don't know what they're entitled to. You could change that, Sarah said. We could change that, Carol corrected. You understand what it's like to be on that side of the table. You could help other women prepare, stay calm, know their rights. Sarah considered it. Like a consulting service for women going through divorce. Exactly. I handle the financial investigation. You help them with the emotional preparation and strategy. We team up to level the playing field. Sarah felt something stir in her chest. Excitement, purpose, the sense that her experience could be turned into something meaningful. I love that idea, she said. Within a year, they had launched Parker Family Advocacy, a small consulting firm that helped women navigate difficult divorces. Carol did financial analysis and asset investigation. Sarah provided emotional support and strategic coaching. Lucas occasionally participated as a witness or consultant when intimidation was an issue. They kept their fees affordable, working on sliding scales for women with limited resources. They partnered with legal aid organizations and shelters. They built a reputation for being thorough, smart, and unafraid of wealthy or powerful opposing parties. Their first major case was Jennifer, the woman who had called Carol. Her husband was a doctor who had hidden over $800,000 in assets through offshore accounts, shell companies, and deliberately undervalued property appraisals. With Carol's investigation and Sarah's support, Jennifer secured a fair settlement and walked away, with the resources she needed to rebuild her life. More importantly, she walked away with her confidence intact, knowing that she had fought back and won. The case took 4 months to resolve, but when it was over, Jennifer sent Sarah and Carol a handwritten note. "You gave me something more valuable than money. You gave me proof that I'm not powerless. Thank you for showing me that quiet strength can win." That note sat framed on the wall of their small office, a converted storefront in Ballard with 2 desks, a conference table, and a filing cabinet full of cases that had ended with justice rather than capitulation. Word spread quickly through Seattle's network of women's shelters, legal aid offices, and domestic violence support groups. Parker Family Advocacy became known as the place to go when you were facing a divorce against someone with money, power, and a strategy designed to intimidate you into accepting nothing. Sarah and Carol developed a reputation for being thorough, relentless, and completely unimpressed by wealthy husbands and expensive attorneys. They specialized in cases where the power imbalance was severe, where women were facing opponents who had deliberately created situations designed to make their wives feel helpless. They worked on sliding scales, charging what clients could afford. For women with no resources, they worked pro bono, covering costs themselves or partnering with legal aid organizations. For clients with some means, they charged reasonable fees. And occasionally, when they helped a client secure a substantial settlement from a particularly egregious case, they would negotiate a percentage fee that helped fund their work with women who had nothing. 5 years after Sarah's divorce, Parker Family Advocacy had helped more than 200 women. They had uncovered millions in hidden assets. They had held dozens of men accountable for fraud, manipulation, and financial abuse. And they'd changed the outcome of countless cases where women had initially appeared helpless, but had actually been strategic, patient, and far stronger than anyone realized. They'd expanded beyond Sarah and Carol. They'd brought on a full-time investigator, a former IRS agent named Patricia Morales, who specialized in tracking hidden money. They'd partnered with a network of pro bono attorneys who handled the actual courtroom work, while Sarah provided client support and Carol handled financial analysis. And Lucas, whenever he was stateside and available, would make appearances in particularly difficult cases where intimidation was a factor. The business model was sustainable, the work was meaningful, and every time they helped a woman walk out of a courtroom with dignity and justice, Sarah thought about that moment when she'd walked into her own divorce hearing without a lawyer and heard the whispers, the mockery, the absolute certainty that she was about to be destroyed. She thought about David's face when Lucas and walked through those doors. She thought about the moment Judge Chen's expression changed from concern to respect. She thought about Carol's testimony, systematically exposing every lie David had told. And she thought about what her mother had said, that power comes in different forms, and the people who underestimate you are giving you the greatest advantage of all. That lesson had changed Sarah's life. Now she was teaching it to others, not through lectures or seminars, but through lived example, by showing women that appearing without a lawyer didn't mean appearing powerless, that silence could be strategic, that asking for help from the right people was smarter than pretending to be self-sufficient, that the game wasn't over until it was over, and sometimes the people who looked defeated were actually just preparing to win in a way no one expected. David Mitchell had thought he'd won before the hearing even started. He'd thought that having money, having a lawyer, having confidence was enough. He'd thought Sarah's silence was weakness. He'd been wrong about everything. And in the end, the woman he'd mocked for not having a lawyer had brought something far more powerful: family who loved her, believed in her, and refused to let her be diminished. That was the real lesson, Sarah realized. Not that you should always bring your Navy SEAL brother and paralegal mother to court, though that certainly didn't hurt. But that strength doesn't always look the way people expect it to. That preparation matters more than performance. That being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you believe it yourself. David had mocked her for having no lawyer. He'd laughed at her silence. He'd assumed her calmness was defeat. He'd learned too late that he'd been watching someone prepare to win in a way he never saw coming. And by the time he realized his mistake, the game was already over. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that quiet strength can be more powerful than loud arrogance, that family can be the greatest weapon against injustice, and that underestimating someone is the fastest way to lose everything, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to remember that showing up alone doesn't mean showing up powerless. Subscribe for more stories about justice, resilience, and the people who prove that the most devastating victories often come from the most unexpected sources. Thanks for watching. And remember, the most dangerous opponent is the one who lets you think you've already won.